realised that for most of the 25-minute journey from Fleettown, she'd been holding her breath. She truly hated being on the water, especially in a boat with all her family on board. She took a deep breath now to steady her nerves. The air was so fresh and cold it hurt the inside of her nose. She shaded her eyes and looked up at the typical postcard shot of Green Bay Village, which consisted of around 40 houses and cottages, a tea shop, the Wincheater Public House, the post office, and a youth hostel which was open in the summer. The only other buildings of significance were the lighthouse behind her, the old schoolhouse with its corrugated iron roof adorned with Christmas lights, and the pretty Norman church. The tourist board couldn't have designed it any better if they'd tried, but for Stephanie, arriving in Green Bay was always tinged with a certain disappointment. It never matched the rather romantic sun-drenched image she held of it in her memory, especially on a day like today. "Be careful!" Stephanie called, as her son Simon barged past her to be first off the boat. In a second he was off, running up the steep cobbled slipway towards the road, where a Santa decoration flapped in the breeze on the iron lamppost. She could tell, as she watched him ignore her warning and spread out his arms to zoom away, that he was thrilled to be back on the island. Like his grandfather, Simon found the sheer expanse of sky a taste of freedom. It was certainly a different world from the one he was used to in their traffic-clogged, graffiti-adorned suburb of Bristol. But at least in Bristol, Simon could be contained. She felt her heart lurch as he reached the road. "David, can you just leave Nat and watch him?" she said, irritated that her husband was unsteadily lifting up Nat, their 5-year-old daughter, as well as 2 of the bags and the rucksack, out of the boat. "Just give her to me," she snapped. "Come to Mummy," she said, holding out her arms. "Simon's fine. Okay? Let him go," David said, as Stephanie took Nat from him. David was tall and still as slim as he was when Stephanie married him 10 years ago, but he looked bulky in the black North Face puffer jacket. His cheeks were pink from the cold boat ride, and his face was creased with laughter lines, but he looked deadly serious as his brown eyes now flashed a warning at her. Stephanie ignored it. She knew he didn't want her to draw attention publicly to Simon, but that was because David refused to recognize that there was a problem. The truth was that Simon was a problem. Or rather, he wasn't. He was perfect. He was her son. But he did need watching. He did need more attention than other 8-year-olds. He just had so much energy, so many thoughts, that sometimes he had difficulty channeling them all productively. That's what the child psychiatrist had told Stephanie. He'd outlined a plan for her and David to help Simon focus more on what was going on around him, and to take each thought at a time and work it through. It infuriated her that David didn't take this as seriously as she did. He was distrustful of psychiatrists. He didn't think Simon needed one. He thought that if they all stuck their heads in the sand, then the problem would simply go away. David brushed roughly past her with the bags as he climbed out of the boat. "Does Uncle Elliot have any more traits?" Nat whispered to Stephanie, giggling conspiratorially. The fake fur trim on her pink suede coat tickled Stephanie's face, and she put her hand out to flatten it down. As she did, she could see that Nat's tongue was blue with food dye. Elliot had been slipping both children handfuls of M&Ms the whole way over behind Stephanie's back as they'd bumped through the spray. She'd wanted to stop him, but she also knew how pleased the kids were to see their favourite uncle. "I thought you were feeling seasick," Stephanie said. "I'm not now, Mummy. Please," Nat begged. "No, you've had enough." Stephanie unloaded the rest of the bags before helping Nat off the boat. Inside, after all the hellos, Stephanie noticed that the house felt different. It was warm, and the soft tones of unobtrusive hotel lobby-style jazz played in the background, rather than the usual dull rumble of Radio 4. It smelt different too, of cinnamon and baking and furniture polish, rather than fishing tackle and sandy wellies. Stephanie had come in the summer when her father had first moved in permanently to this, their old family holiday home, after having sold the house in Exeter. But she was surprised to see everything now fully unpacked. The grandfather clock, the rocking chair, the old black and white photograph of her father in his university gown. His sailing ship prints had all found places on the hallway walls. Stephanie held Nat's hand as they moved through to the dining room off the hall, where the mahogany table had been polished until it shone. In the corner by the fire, a brand-new synthetic tree was laden with bows, lights, and decorations. It could have been in a window display at Harrods. It was so beautifully done. Stephanie felt her heart sink with disappointment. This was her job. She'd been hoping to find the old Christmas box, which was stuffed full of a tangled collection of Christmas essentials. Just the smell of it and its contents. A few strings of dog-eared tinsel. A child's shoebox full of baubles, tarnished angel chimes, old red candles, a nativity scene which had lost most of its characters years ago. And the battered box containing the synthetic tree that her family had had since the Woolworths special offer in 1981, took her straight back to a time when Christmas meant something. And this year, more than ever, she needed a glimpse of that feeling. She'd been looking forward to sharing her Christmas tree decorating ritual with Nat, as she once had with her mother. She'd hoped that her daughter would also enjoy finding the box, assembling the tree, and hanging up the chipped red and gold baubles. It was one of the things that reminded Stephanie most of being a child herself.
"Oh,"
Nat said, clearly disappointed.
"Mummy, you said we could do the tree."
"Oh, God," Isabel said, clasping her hands together. Stephanie could see that the skin on them was perfect, her large, square-cut diamond engagement ring as showy as ever.
"We were just desperate for something to do last night when we were waiting for you all to arrive."
Isabel put her hand out and touched Stephanie's arm. Her nails were French manicured, and Stephanie wondered where she found the time to be so indulgent. She was a captain of industry, wasn't she? Wasn't that meant to involve some actual work?
"And I thought we'd agreed we'd do the tree before Christmas Eve,"
Isabel said, her Southern American accent as soft and seductive as ever. Stephanie often wondered whether it was Isabel's accent alone that had made her so successful in business, as well as in securing her brother's heart. Because if you took away her voice and went on looks alone, and the steel-hard, don't mess with me eyes, Isabel was truly terrifying. Stephanie had no grounds to argue with her now, remembering Isabel's call a few weeks ago. Stephanie had been in a supermarket queue trying to deal with Simon and Nat fighting, and she hadn't had a chance to listen properly before Isabel had closed her into agreeing with whatever it was she was proposing. So now Stephanie assumed that this was the first fallout from Isabel's planned timetable. It was her own fault she'd missed out on the tree, or rather, it was David's. They should have been here last night with Isabel and Taylor, but David, who'd been tied up on a deadline at the computer magazine where he was an editor, had changed the plans at the last minute. There was no point in being childish, Stephanie told herself. It was only a tree. "Yes, of course we did." "Did you find any of Dad's decorations?" Stephanie asked.
"I found a box full of stuff, but I threw most of it away. Oh my God, Jerry has been keeping such a collection of old junk." Stephanie bit her lip. Well, it looks lovely, she forced herself to say. Doesn't it? Isabel said, pleased with the compliment. There's plenty of other things to do, Stephanie said to Nat. I think it's rather lovely that Auntie Isabel has made the house so Christmassy. Nat pointed towards the mass of presents perfectly wrapped under the tree. Look at all those! Are they for us? She asked. Isabel smiled and leant down so that her face was level with Nat's. Some of them, Natasha. Suddenly, Isabel gasped. Sweetheart, what on earth have you done to your head? I slipped on the doorstep at home, Nat said as Isabel pushed up Nat's dark fringe to reveal the bruise on her forehead. Isabel looked up at Stephanie. It's just a bump, Stephanie said, angry at the shame and guilt that instantly rose up in her. It wouldn't go away. She felt Isabel was judging her now, the same as she'd felt as if everyone had been judging her since what had happened last summer. It was like everything she'd been before, a respected GP, a strong and successful mother, and a caring daughter and a loving wife, had been wiped away by the events of a single second. That day had changed everything, forever. Even though everyone knew it hadn't been her fault, Stephanie wondered how many conversations Isabel had had with Elliot behind her back. How many times had they laid the blame at her feet? Could it even be as many times as she had done herself? You were very brave, weren't you, darling? Stephanie told Nat, giving the bruise a gentle kiss. Now, why don't you go and see how Grandpa is getting on? When they'd arrived at the house, her father had announced that he was going to be busy chopping up logs in the back garden whilst they all settled in. She looked out of the dining room window, but could only see Rufus digging a hole in the lawn. Her father must be hiding in the shed. Stephanie and Isabel both watched Nat running off back to the hall. Neither of them spoke. Stephanie had been about to elaborate on the accident that had resulted in Nat's injury, but instead she let the moment pass. She didn't have to justify herself, not to anyone. So, how have you been? She asked, steering the conversation onto fresh ground as they moved through towards the kitchen. Just so hectic, Isabel said. You know how it is. Work, family, Christmas. Stephanie nodded, but the truth was that she didn't know. Isabel was one of the top directors of a big mobile phone company. She dealt with marketing slogans and product launches. Stephanie with broken femurs and weeping old men. Their worlds couldn't have been further apart. But what the heck? It's the holidays now. You know, I can't remember the last time I had more than 2 days when I didn't have to do something for work, Isabel continued. And it's so great not to be travelling. Those red-eye flights, man, they're a killer. And there's no chance of it all slowing down in the new year? Forget it. The industry moves so fast. It's a full-time job just staying on top of developments. And we're restructuring, which doesn't help. I had to make 105 people redundant last week. 105? Stephanie repeated, shocked. She knew from her experience in the doctor's surgery the devastating effects on people's health that redundancy could make. Those poor people. Right before Christmas. I know. But the way I figure it, at least they'll be with their families and have time to reflect. Firing them in January would be so much worse. Bad news to start off the year and broke after Christmas. Just awful. This way, they can make a fresh start. Isabel nodded as if her justification closed the topic. She always did that, Stephanie now remembered. She had an unshakable belief that everyone should see the world the way she did. Their path was blocked by David, who appeared in the kitchen doorway, wrestling Simon. Isabel stepped out of the way quickly. "Oh, my," she said, slipping into her shocked Southern Belle accent again. Simon crashed onto the floor, laughing. "You two," Stephanie said, glancing at Isabel. Isabel's expression hadn't changed, but Stephanie momentarily wondered whether she was thinking that children should be seen and not heard. That would go some way to explaining why Isabel and Elliot had packed off their only child to boarding school. Elliot had said that it was because of their work commitments, but Stephanie couldn't imagine sending Simon or Nat away from her. Not for a day. But then, Isabel had never been very maternal. She'd fallen pregnant with Taylor within a year of meeting Elliot, when she was just finishing her master's and he'd been on a sabbatical with a law firm in New York. At first, Isabel had freaked out about ruining her career chances, but Elliot, besotted with his blonde, beautiful prom queen and intent on doing the right thing, had proposed and brought her back to England. Isabel had checked into an expensive private maternity hospital before employing a full-time nanny and a personal fitness coach, whilst recovering from her elective caesarean, much to the bemusement of Stephanie and her parents. A giant traditional wedding had followed, during which Stephanie had held Taylor all day, as if Taylor had been her baby and not connected to the bride and groom at all. Within a month, Isabel had taken a running jump at her career ladder and hadn't looked back since. "Be careful," Stephanie told David, flicking her eyes towards Isabel. "We're only playing," David said, as Stephanie helped Simon back onto his feet. "Yes, and you're 4 stone heavier than him. Just watch it, okay? Let him calm down." "Oh, let them play," Isabel said, smiling at David. "Simon's turned into a real tiger, hasn't he?" So much for Isabel believing in kids being seen but not heard. Or maybe it was just her own kid who Isabel didn't like mucking around, Stephanie thought. "Ladies," Elliot said, stepping forward and joining the bulging family portrait which the kitchen doorway now framed. "Can I interest you in a drink? There's some wonderful mulled wine on the go." He buried his nose into a steaming glass in his hand. "Ah, fruity," he said. "Might as well start as we mean to go on." "In a minute. Do you mind if I go and unpack first?" Stephanie said. "I've put you and David in the green room," Isabel said. "I thought it would be more comfortable and nearer the kids. Now then, where has Taylor got to? I know she's so looking forward to seeing Simon." Upstairs, Stephanie pushed open the bedroom door, feeling unduly annoyed. David joined her, carrying the rest of the bags. "What is it?" David asked, as Stephanie groaned. She pointed to the twin beds which had been pushed together. The corners of the quilt had been pulled down, and a little box of chocolates had been set on each of the plumped-up pillows. "So what?" David asked. "It's just a bit of fun." "It's not a bloody hotel." "She's just trying to help." "She's not my mother. I wish she'd stopped acting like she owned the place." Stephanie went over to pick up the 2 hot water bottles which had each been positioned on a graded set of folded green towels. She wanted to throw them out of the window or through it. This was her father's house, her only surviving parental home. Surely it wasn't too much to expect not to be treated like a guest, especially by Isabel. She wished again that they'd arrived first. At least then Stephanie could have organised the sleeping arrangements herself. At home, she and David slept in separate rooms. It had been that way for 9 months, ever since Nat had begun having nightmares and wetting her bed at least twice a week, waking up and screaming, gasping for air. Stephanie slept on the playroom sofa bed, next to Nat's room, so that she could get to her before she woke up Simon. Stephanie couldn't remember the last time she'd been naked in front of David, let alone been in bed next to him. But it was too late to make a fuss now. There was a long pause. She braced herself, expecting David to have a go at her for all their grievances on the journey, but, to her surprise, he checked the door was closed and then moved towards her. He nodded to the bed and the hot water bottles in Stephanie's hands. It should be quite cosy. We might not need those. His tone sounded placatory, friendly even. Stephanie was so taken off guard that it took her a moment to realize his real motive. Then she tensed, appalled by his insinuation. "David, I really don't think—" she began, stepping away from him and hugging both empty hot water bottles to her chest. She felt queasy, as if he were a stranger making an unwelcome pass at her. David ran his hand over his hair. "Can't we just—" "What?" "It's Christmas, Steph," he said. A pleading tone had crept into his voice. "I don't know. I don't want it to be like this. These past few weeks have been worse than ever. You've been behaving as if you hate me." He looked at her hopefully, as if she was going to deny it. Stephanie looked quickly away from him at the floor, fear gripping her chest as she glimpsed, in the shadows of her mind, words she never dreamed she'd say. They weren't fully formed yet, but she knew what they were. Once they were out, everything would change. David stepped towards her and laid his hand on her arm. His fingers were long and tanned. She used to call them piano players' hands and tease him that he could be a hand model. She used to love them. But now? She was so tired, she thought. Tired of waiting for it all to get better. Tired of hating the fact that they didn't talk anymore. Tired of being scared of what would happen if they did. "What is it?" David persisted. Her whole body seemed to cringe away from him. These were the hands that had failed Paul, and no amount of counselling could change the fact that she couldn't bear for them to touch her. "I'm going down to have a drink. They'll be waiting," Stephanie said. "Stephanie, please, let's just get through this Christmas, okay?" Stephanie walked out of the bedroom onto the landing, her eyes blurring with unwanted tears. Over the banister she looked down into the hallway below. "I can't find Dad. He's disappeared," Elliot was saying, coming through the front door. "Hey, hey, hey," she heard Isabel say. Then Stephanie saw her walking towards Elliot with a cheeky grin. "Just relax, baby. He'll show up soon enough." She pulled him by the lapels of his coat, steering him under the huge bunch of mistletoe which hung from the light in the hall. Stephanie hadn't even noticed it was there. "Izzy, what are you doing?" Elliot said, but there was a smile in his voice. "You don't think you're going to get away with it that easily, do you?" Isabel said, putting her arms up around his neck. "I want a proper Christmas hello from you, mister." Stephanie looked away as Isabel leant in to kiss Elliot. She stepped silently into the bathroom, her heart beating fast. That was all she'd wanted when she'd got married. To be in love with David, just like Elliot and Isabel were with each other. She turned on the tap and washed her face. She watched the water swirling down the plug hole. She'd never considered that love could simply drain away through the cracks in a marriage, but that's what had happened. And the fact that David wanted to carry on as normal, as if nothing had changed, especially at Christmas, made her want to punish him more than ever. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. Next to Isabel, she looked old and worn out, she thought. She reached into the pocket of her fleece, pulling out her purse, where she was sure she had a lipstick in amongst the change. As she opened the wallet, she saw the picture in the clear pouch. It was a miniature print of the photograph on the mantelpiece at home. She carried it everywhere with her. It was a traditional portrait of her and David with their 3 children, taken at a photographer's studio 2 years ago. And there was Paul, their second son, sitting on Stephanie's lap, smiling without his front teeth, his expression so innocent and happy, his hair soft and dark like hers. Her Paul, she thought. Her poor, poor Paul. She turned away from the photo, its image etched on her memory. It was almost too painful to look at, because in none of their faces was a single trace of all the ruined Christmases stretching